Hello, dear friends. My name is Vasil Pekhnyo. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and I invite all of you to watch this latest update on Ukrainian battle map situation. So please join, watch this video. This is the fresh update as of September the 27th. This actually Saturday. The summary of the whole week. So like this video, share it, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and leave your comments below. Let's begin. And we'll start with the Kupyansk direction. What's happening there. In particular, Deep State reports the latest on the Kupyansk area. Right now, a large area of the right bank of Kupyansk, the right bank of the Oskil River, has already become a gray zone. Here you can see these patches of gray zone that are really spreading throughout all of Kupyansk. The thing is, for a long time now on the southern outskirts of Kupyansk, ever since the very first, let's say, the first iteration of the Russians advancing or rushing into the city, the enemy has already been detected on the southern outskirts of this city. There's a southern district, a micro neighborhood called Yuvileni, and that's where the enemy has been detected. Now, because they've gotten in there, they're basically spreading constantly, let's say, like a plague through the city. We'll look to describe what is actually happening right now, as it is, in fact. Indeed, the armed forces of Ukraine, really, the defense forces have stopped this flow of Russian assault troops that was coming through the pipeline. That flow doesn't exist now. And in addition to this, it can also be added that the logistics of Kupyansk, or rather the logistics of the occupiers who are advancing toward Kupyansk in the triangle of Kindrashivka, Radkivka, and Holubivka, in other words, in this triangle, are being cut off. So-called kill zones are being created here to prevent the enemy from moving toward Kupyansk as they would like. And accordingly, within these kill zones, survival for the enemy in Kupyansk is, frankly speaking, not the easiest task. That is, we can talk about, well, it's not exactly the same as what's happening in our Pokrovsk direction, but it's a relative blockade of the enemy within Kupyansk. But there is one but. First of all, as soon as the enemy advanced to Kupyansk, there were already such assessments, there were already such forecasts that there were from 100 to 150 of them there. I'm not authorized to say exactly how many there were, although I do know a more or less precise number, but it was a lot. And these numbers, let's put it this way, are not far from what was actually the case. There were a lot of enemy forces there, and this a lot, as I said from the very beginning, since the start of this Kupyansk problem, the breakthrough into the city, the very fact of the enemy's presence in the city already creates incredible tension, incredible problems. Because, and actually, the official communication that was previously voiced saying that supposedly the enemy is not in the center, but is on the northern outskirts, so you shouldn't worry too much about it. That doesn't work, because it's not true. Because in reality, this is a serious problem. Imagine when several dozen occupiers appear in the city and start spreading throughout such a large city like microbes, which are very difficult to detect with drones. On top of that, these microbes mix in with the civilian population that remains in Kupyansk. I talked about this yesterday. That's about 700 people, civilians, who are still living in Kupyansk. And by changing into civilian clothes, the occupiers basically scout out the situation. They change clothes, walk around, observe how the armed forces of Ukraine react, try to spot them as the enemy, see whether they are identified as the enemy or not, and check whether there are any observation posts in our Kupyansk or not. And similar things, well, the Russians are more than happy to do using disguises by changing into civilian clothes. So accordingly, driving the enemy out of here is a very difficult task right now. It was already a difficult task before, but after the Russians entered the city in significant numbers, their survival there, well, it's not guaranteed, but it's highly likely, because in Kupyansk, you can search houses for something to eat, something to take, a place to hide, or somewhere to spend the night. Yes, there is no infrastructure. Yes, the city is completely destroyed. But nevertheless, for an enemy who is used to living in filth, these are basically quite normal conditions. That's why Deep State wrote yesterday that the situation in Kupyansk remains quite difficult and that the enemy continues to infiltrate there. However, let me repeat once again, the enemy's ability to use the pipeline, the gas pipeline, was stopped. So now the Russians have returned to their old method of moving across the river through the tree lines. From there, they make their way into the city itself, although now in much smaller numbers. After all, the problem with the pipeline was that it actually provided a very steady and large flow of Russians to the northwestern outskirts of the city. And from there, they would already get into Kupyansk itself. But this doesn't make the situation in the city any less, well, quite difficult. At the same time, I want to emphasize once again, it's because of the presence of civilians. This is a problem that needs to be highlighted, emphasized, talked about, because the Russians, well, they just They are doing just fantastically terrorist things, so to speak, killing civilians on an absolutely massive scale, including in Kherson. There were reports that the Russians killed people. There is simply video evidence. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't even know what the right words are in this context, because the Russians simply killed two civilians who were traveling in the Berislav district. They struck them with drones, FPV drones. They saw and identified that these were civilians, but, well, you see, recently there have also been incidents like the one with Shandriholov in the Lyman direction, where they actually took our girl hostage, a minor girl whose family was shot, and they used her as a human shield. The exact same thing tragically happened in Kherson, and again, I will emphatically repeat this crucial point. In the Berislav district, they simply and brutally killed two innocent civilians whom they clearly saw moving, and they deliberately struck them down. Besides that, Berislav is located right here, specifically to the north, very close to Kozatske. Here you can clearly see Berislav. It is indeed our significant settlement situated on the right bank of the mighty Dnipro River, meaning it's in our hands, but in general it's ours. Any settlements there in the Kherson region are ours. But as for Kherson itself, the Russians continue to simply terrorize it with a huge number of shellings. Again, they take pleasure in these terrorist shellings, posting about them on their social media, rejoicing over this fact. You can see videos showing how Kherson is really being hit by an incredibly intense barrage of shelling. We already understand, I think everyone understands perfectly well, that in the current situation, any kind of landing operations are simply impossible. They can't be prepared or carried out. What is a landing operation? A landing operation is when paratroopers are deployed, right, for the purpose of a landing mission. Right now, imagining that paratroopers could be dropped is just simply unrealistic. You can't even properly land with equipment because drones just destroy everything. But terrorizing a city in real time, like a war criminal, as is constantly shown on the screens with the city of Kherson, that unfortunately the Russians do willingly, well, that's the truly sad and deeply unfortunate story that we have here unfolding about the dire situation in Kherson. By the way, if we return to the context of the civilian population and the taking of the girl hostage, whom the Russians used as a human shield in Shandriholov, that's the Lyman direction. Let's move over there now. This, in fact, is bearing some fruit, because even recently on the deep state map, you can see this enemy advance, their movement to another area, essentially an attempt to gain a foothold on the other bank of the Nitrius River, which runs here through Shandriholov. What was the main point there? What, in general, is the main point of the fighting on the front line right now? It's that Russian troops, wherever they go, their assault units are immediately destroyed. But they can save themselves, preserve their lives, if they quickly run between houses, if they quickly find some shelter. And in these shelters, in these houses, they find provisions or something else, and so on. And even if they enter the houses, our drones still track them because some signs of activity appear. And these drones instantly destroy the house along with the occupiers who have taken shelter there. But unfortunately, in this case, in the case of Shandriholov, the occupiers got in. Well, just imagine the situation. The occupiers come in, take a girl hostage, and move around with her, simply holding her in front of them, going from house to house, taking up positions and living in that house, using her as a shield. As a result, our soldiers' hands are tied. Well, we simply cannot just fly a drone directly into the building and then proceed to destroy the entire structure, thereby risking significant harm to that innocent girl who is currently inside. So what should we do in such a situation? What should we do in such a situation? This is really just a completely rhetorical question. Here, the only option is for assault troops to go in on foot and try to eliminate the enemy. But still, the girl's life is in danger. And this is just, well, just a desperate appeal, a plea, I don't know, to all civilians. Your life is in danger. The Russians have now received orders, basically, at best to use civilians as human shields, and at worst simply to dispose of them, to destroy them, just like the family of civilians they shot here in Shandriholov in the Lyman direction. Unfortunately, by the way, Lyman needs to be highlighted. We need to talk about it because the situation in the Lyman direction receives very little media coverage, while in reality it is extremely, extremely difficult. Because if we move, for example, to the satellite image on the deep state map and take a look, as I have mentioned more than once before, this is not some kind of secret, as if I am giving away the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. No, absolutely not, of course. What we're talking about here is that on the satellite image, you can see the routes along which, in principle, our garrison can move out of Lyman. Here is the settlement of Lyman. Let's highlight it in bright yellow. It'll be easier to see on this kind of map. Here is the settlement of Drobyshev, and further on, Novoselivka. And this basically is the road through Novoselivka, the only route available to the Lyman garrison. So it goes through Drobyshev, Novoselivka, and then further west.
And that's exactly why in this area, the occupiers are pushing as hard as they can from the Shandri Holov area toward Novoselivka in order to physically cut off our connection. And as a result, this creates just a fantastic future pressure and deterioration of the situation, both in the Lyman direction, and potentially this will affect, well, not even potentially, it is already affecting the Slovyansko-Kramatorsk agglomeration, because it is precisely from the area of that same Drobyshev and the enemy's advance here that they are impacting our highway, which is the main route connecting Slovyansk and the city of Izium in the Kharkiv region. This highway, the international transport route, this is the one we're talking about. The enemy's drones are already operating along it. These are all consequences of the Lyman direction, which I'll repeat once again, in my opinion, receives inadequately little coverage in our media regarding the situation and the issues our troops are facing, including our rear units in this area. That's why it needs to be talked about. At the moment, the situation here is difficult. There is a difficult situation in Kupyansk, and there is a difficult situation in the Novopavlivka direction at the junction with the Dnipropetrovsk region. I don't even know anymore. I just repeat the same things day after day, because in reality, the situation at the front doesn't really change much. It doesn't change much at all. Some new facts appear. There are some new advances, small advances, new trends emerge, and certain actions have their consequences. But overall, everything remains, at a steady level. The Russians are pressing in the difficulty is at 4 points: Kupyansk, Lyman, Siversk, probably we can add here Pokrovsk with Dobropilia, and the junction of Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. So if we talk about the Pokrovsk direction, then first of all, the main outcome of the week, among other things, is Dobropilia. This Dobropilia area, which even the occupiers themselves have started to proclaim, saying that supposedly they have large encirclements forming there. Such images are appearing on Z channels, so to speak, where you can see 3 zones of enemy encirclement. Well, I already told you about these 3 encirclements, friends, in the review of the battle map last week. In fact, information about this came out during my interview with the head of the Assault Troops Directorate, Colonel Manko, Valentin Manko, who leads all those assault regiments that are carrying out missions in the Pokrovsk area, and among others in the Novopavlivka direction. Although there are a lot of questions regarding these regiments, about their creation in general, and the necessity of establishing assault troops. In my opinion, these are wrong decisions by the state. Without going into the details of whether assault troops are conceptually needed or not, I will say just one thing. Imagine that we are now creating yet another branch of the military. By the way, yesterday, Syrskyi also announced that an entire branch of the military will be created.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Air defense within the Air Force, which will operate on replacement drones. This will be separated into a distinct branch of the military. Obviously, this prospect is still very distant, simply because there aren't enough people to make such things happen. We have just carried out a corps reform. We now have about 12.5 corps. That's a huge number. For these corps, I'll even share a little secret with you. We don't have enough generals, so to speak. Just imagine there's this ongoing trend to constantly criticize generals, but we actually don't have enough generals who not only have a star, let alone anything more. That is, right now, many colonels could be promoted to brigadier general and put in charge of a corps, among other things. But people need to be trained. It's a completely different level to lead a battalion, to command a brigade, and especially to command a corps at the corps level. Those are, in fact, 3 very different things. And this kind of training, obviously, we don't provide. Moreover, there isn't a full complement of these troops. There aren't enough personnel to even fill the standard structure of the corps. And yet we're already moving toward creating another branch of the military. Does that seem logical? In my opinion, not really. This is, a somewhat reckless approach. But in any case, we have the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. It's his decision, his conviction. That's how he put it. Well, let's get back to the point that, to be fair, the assault regiments here on the Dobropilia front really did carry out these encirclements, cutoffs, or rather cauldrons for the occupiers that the Z military bloggers are talking about. Although, as they say, it's not that simple, and in some locations, physical expulsion of the enemy is still ongoing. It's still too early to talk about complete encirclement of the enemy, because there's a settlement called Mayak, which is partly in the red zone and partly in the gray zone. And right here, one of the assault regiments, the 225th Assault Regiment, showed footage of how they are striking the enemy. So the enemy is still present here. To say that the occupiers have completely surrendered here No, because in the prevailing conditions of this particular kind of drone warfare, especially when advanced ground robotic systems or substantial heavy drones that can effectively deliver crucial supplies or even weaponry to the front lines are actively in use, surrendering is quite often not a viable option for many Russian soldiers. And the Black Swan unit, the 225th Assault Regiment, is showing how they destroy occupiers who are on our own defensive positions. You can see here our huge trenches with dugouts, ditches, and trenches. For example, how the enemy is eliminated in one of the dugouts. Moreover, it's a concrete fortification, a concrete stronghold. The enemy got in there, but it didn't help them. In this case, by the way, the concrete actually works against the enemy. Well, anyway, that's a separate story. The main point here is that this is happening in a location near Mayak. So to say that the enemy is absolutely no longer present there, has surrendered and is demoralized, would not be accurate. As for demoralization, yes, maybe you could say that, but in reality, they are still maintaining the intensity of combat operations. Yesterday, there was a report to the president from our military command. We see our staff, Anatov, the commander-in-chief Syrski, defense minister Shmihal, and the president's security advisor Pavlo Polisa. They were reporting the situation to the president. As a result, the commander-in-chief came out with the message that our defenders have already liberated about 170 square kilometers of territory in the Dobropilia direction. That is, this is the area that has already been traversed on foot by assault troops and marked as a green zone. And they have cleared 187 square kilometers of saboteurs. Well, these are different concepts. That is, where the enemy is present and where he is cut off from supplies. This whole story now covers about 300 plus square kilometers of territory in the Dobropilia direction. According to Zelensky, the occupiers' losses in this operation already amount to almost 3,000 people, most of whom are irrecoverable. The exchange fund is also being replenished, according to the president. This is what is happening in the northern part of the Pokrovsk direction. In the south, the situation is worse, and I keep emphasizing this. This is also one of the conclusions that needs to be discussed. Listen, I'm not even touching on the topic I described in great detail yesterday. Why is a counteroffensive impossible? It's nonsense to talk about that right now, because we have locations, for example, in the south where the situation is still difficult. We have the enemy, for instance, pressing along the entire line across the whole section of the front from Udachne through Kotlin, Pershetravnia to Novopavlivka, and ultimately Lysivka as well, where the 25th is holding the defense. The enemy is putting pressure on all of this, and in some places is having successes. For example, take Udachne itself, which at one time was deoccupied from the enemy, but the enemy is present here particularly due to the large number of industrial facilities. There are mines in Udachne. Because of the large number of industrial facilities, the enemy uses them. This is similar to what's happening in Kupyansk, so to speak. That's why being within the city limits poses major problems and threats. If we look at Udachne via satellite, we can also see that there are mines, industrial facilities, and the famous hangars here. Further north, you can see there are even more of these industrial type facilities. And this is exactly where the enemy is constantly trying to advance. So regarding Udachne, if we're talking about it, the enemy is present in Udachne. Undoubtedly, they are here and they are holding this settlement, trying to control it. Meanwhile, we are trying to destroy them there. By the way, our aviation is working very actively. Just the other day, I also spoke with a pilot from the Air Force who said that right now our fighters are working to the maximum in Donetsk region, especially drone operators in Donetsk region. Although it should be acknowledged and noted that the concentration of enemy aircraft in the Donetsk region is also simply sky high. There are simply 3 or 4 Su-24S patrolling around the clock, 24/7, watching our aircraft so that when our planes go into action, they can immediately target them, instantly, so to speak. Unfortunately, the Russians can afford such a luxury. And our pilots, constantly entering the enemy air defense detection zones, still manage to strike the enemy. And one of these strikes, which was published on the Telegram community Sonyahnik, a community of Air Force fighters, shows right at the precise location of an industrial facility, or rather what's left of it, an airstrike by our air group on the enemy who had entrenched themselves there in Udachne, with quite obviously their complete destruction. That is, right now, our aviation is not operating on as large a scale or in such numbers as the Russians, who are not carpet bombing. Sorry, that's not the right word, but with high intensity bombarding our lands with glide bombs. Our aviation operates in smaller numbers, more precisely, and with higher quality, less in quantity, but more targeted and effective. So that's what we do. We counter quantity with quality. And this in particular is what you see with the strike in Udachne by our aviators. To sum up, to put a period on it, the situation, I'm already allergic to these words. Yes, difficult, but controlled. That's what Syrskyi said yesterday, that the situation at the front is difficult but under control. Well, it's not fully stabilized. You can't say it's completely under control. Not in all areas, to be precise. It is like that, but the general direction is about the same. It's moving towards, everything is moving towards control, although with a huge number of questions and problems. That's how things are, friends. On that note, I'll put a period. Thank you for your attention. Take care of yourselves. All the best, and see you next time.